All right, without further ado, my name is Jeffrey Tay. I'll be hosting this particular session's titled Cyber Crisis and Data Privacy. We're very honored to have all our speakers here today. The very honorable Mr. Tony Lam, Deputy Privacy Commissioner, Office of the Privacy Commissioner for Personal Data. I also like to thank our sponsor for this particular sessions, Shannon Shedwick, Senior Managing Director from Ancora, and his colleague here, Fred Chance, that represent Ancora. So Fred is over there, ladies and gentlemen. He's here, okay? Okay, and we have Jason. Is Jason here? Oh yeah, hi Jason. Jason Lau, Chief Information Security Officer from Crypto.com. We have Parag. Parag, how are you? Parag Deotra, Director for Information Security for VF Corporation. And we have, is Anson joining us today? I have not seen him log on yet. That's okay, no problem. So let's just kickstart for our first questions, okay? I understand that we have session after sessions. 1 second. So last time we spoke, before we come to it, is that, let's just start with an easy question first. Tony, can you provide the audience today any update and best practices we should know or be aware of from your office?
Thank you. Good morning. And talking about cybersecurity and data privacy, the first point which I would like to make is that cybersecurity and data privacy are basically twins. They go hand in hand. But I have to stress that even if you have the best possible cybersecurity defense measures in place, it does not mean that you would necessarily be fully protected from data privacy, because a lot of data breach are attributed to human errors. Let me try to give 2 examples. One happened in later 2018, and perhaps the audience here would remember that a local airline had data leakage of about 9.4 million of its customers. And we investigated the case, and the airline had attackers exploited the vulnerability of its server. It's an internet-facing server. And in that particular investigation, it revealed that the vulnerability had been in place for 10 years, since 2007, while they built up the server in 2017. So that was a quite well-known vulnerability, but somehow the scan, when they set up the server, did not find it out, and it made a vulnerable point for the attackers to get into the system. And so it could not be said that reasonably practicable measures have been put in place in order to protect the personal data held by the airline. And the scanning tool which they used actually had the ability to detect that vulnerability since 2013. So it is kind of unfortunate that there were human errors. Another example which I would like to share with you related to a data breach of a mobile communications service provider. Back in April 2018, and a database of that particular mobile communication service provider was hacked, and 380,000 customers' information was leaked. What went wrong? In brief, the incident involved an inactive database of the company concerned, and that particular inactive database involved the personal data of their customers. As of 2012, the database in question should have been deleted after the company had done system migration in 2012. But somehow the database was not removed, and it escaped the memory and attention of the company. It got connected with the network, and no security patches were done. And so we find that reasonably practicable measures have not been taken by the company concerned. And the company also failed to give due consideration to the period of data retention. So the point which I would like to stress, number 1, human factor is a factor which we all have to pay attention to, apart from putting strong cybersecurity defense. Second point, best practice. If you have a data breach, inform the regulator first. We will try to share advice or observations with you to contain damage, and also notify the affected customers. So these are the 2 points of advice which I would like to share.
Great, Tony, thank you. The next question is perhaps Shannon, you can chip in as well. Shannon, I know, ladies and gentlemen, Shannon based in Australia, so all the way from Australia. And I believe that you've been helping clients in APAC region as well, right, Shannon?
Yes, that's right.
And in particularly the area of governance, risk and compliance, in the area of cyber security and cyber risk. Am I correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so the question is here. This is a question for Tony and yourself. The audience that we have here, mostly legal, audit, risk and compliance. We have a few CISO today as well, joining us online and here. The frustration they all have is that as much as they have and wanted to comply with the data privacy rules, or GDPR or CCPA, or local Hong Kong or even local data privacy rule, they know sooner or later they may be a victim of cyber attack. Now, just before, I'm just gonna basically live audiences. Who is worried about cyber attack in their company? Legal compliance. One, only one, two? Wow. All right. I'm not. We're not doing poll. Oh, actually, there are a few people raising hand as well. Tara raising hand online. When that happens, what can they do to ensure they minimize the risk of exposure and penalty? Let's Tony start with, shall we?
Okay, thank you. Your question is on what they should do when they have these breaches. I think number one thing to bear in mind is that prevention is always better than cure. So your actions should start very first, not only wait until when there are incidents. So what should we do? Our observation and advice would be that a company should put in place their policies, practices, and mechanisms, including, for instance, incident response mechanism, so that when the data breach comes, they can deal with it already with some prior preparation, and they would not be caught by surprise when they have the crisis. And this has to be well thought out in advance, and this has to be from the top, because only from the top, with the determination to tackle these data breaches, would you put resources into it. When you have these policy, practices, and mechanisms in place, you would certainly need technical and organizational measures so that the whole policy is institutionalized with adequate resources to implement it. And just let me draw an analogy. If you treat data as money because the data is so important, and you know that with money you keep safe custody, you know how much money you have. So for data, you should have a data inventory, personal data inventory, and you should be very familiar with the personal data flows inside or outside your company, so that when things went wrong, you probably would stand a better chance to find out what actually happened and where the vulnerable points are. And you've got professional accountants to look after your money in your company. So better to have a data protection officers to look after your personal data. And through all these means, you try to put data management in an institutionalized process from cradle to grave to protect your data. And once you have a system in place, and if there is a data breach in your company, you need to ensure that you have a quick response system whereby the incident could be escalated to the management level in order to deal with it quickly, efficiently, by looking into the interests of not only your company itself, but also the affected subjects. On the one hand, as I have said earlier on, try to notify the regulator and try to notify the customers as soon as possible. The thing which you do not want to happen is to get your corporate reputation tarnished because of the way you deal with the problem. The way you deal with the problem, whether or not you show adequate respect to your customer, whether you are fair to them, or whether or not you have spent too much time to look after your own interests, would create an impression on the part of the customer. And if you lose the trust of the customer, on your company, it would be very difficult to regain. So that's our advice. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Shannon?
Tony, great response. Following off on the back of what Tony just said, I think it's important and focusing specific on your question around legal compliance, there is a mistake that we often see companies and federal government agencies and state government agencies make here in Australia and in wider APAC is they adopt a tick the box compliance approach that isn't specific to their organization, and they believe that compliance somehow equals security, whilst data security and privacy regulations and standards are a good place to start, and it is not going to equal security for your organization. You need to take a risk-based approach about risks that are specific to your organization, and to do that, it's exactly what Tony said. You need to take stock of the data and the critical assets that you have in your business and what underpins the operations of your business and what it couldn't survive without, and apply the appropriate controls to those critical assets, protecting your crown jewels, so to speak. And to do that, you need to be aware of both the likelihood and the potential impact that if these risks were realized, it would have on your business, and prioritize according to that methodology. Even banks with their hundreds of millions of dollars in budget every year can't protect everything. So you need to protect what is most important and prioritize from there. So legal compliance, whilst a good place to start, can steer people down the wrong direction or give them a false sense of security that if they're compliant with a certain standard that they're protected.
We can't protect everything. We just basically pick the crown jewel. Is that what it is?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Okay. So the next question is actually perhaps Jason and Shannon, you can shed a light on it. Cyber risk is now top priority risk for most organizations. From a risk management perspective, what policy should we put in place? What training and awarenesses is needed, and how to ensure board members understand the legal implication of cyber risk? Shall we go for Parag first, and then after that, or Jason first? Sorry, Jason.
Sure. So again, thank you for inviting me today. I think Tony has covered a lot of good points. I think Shannon's also touched on real life requirements on the risk side. So just to follow up on what they had mentioned, and also to address your question specifically about what policies the company should put in place. So from a security perspective, there are lots of different standards that are out there, but some of the more common ones are, for example, ISO 27001, which is an information security standard that's been around for quite some time. And then an extension of that, which came out in 2019, is the new ISO 27701 certification, which focuses much specifically on data privacy. So many are using these to marry together to help with compliance for on the journey towards GDPR or on the journey towards regulatory compliance. But as Shannon correctly said, many of these are tick boxes. So it tests your compliance to, do you have the right policies in place? Do you have the right procedures in place? But just because you do does not necessarily mean that you're all safe and all good. Companies can actually go and specify the scope of their audit. So if, for example, they have a certification, it doesn't necessarily mean that that company is a company-wide audit. So you have to be very careful that certifications are great, but you shouldn't just hide behind the fact that you've just got this certification. Risk-based approach, thinking about from a privacy perspective, from a top-down perspective, and also from a culture perspective. Now, one of the questions that you had mentioned is how should companies actually go about doing this? And one of the key things to start off with is really about accountability. So as Tony also mentioned, many companies nowadays are appointing a data protection officer, or you've got a CISO. These roles maybe 5-10 years ago didn't really exist at all. And many CISO roles, maybe where they did exist, would report to the IT director or to the CTO. Now we're seeing the CISO role become more independent, reporting to the CEO, and then you've got the DPO reporting to the board, for example. And by seeing more of this transition in industry, we're actually seeing much more of an evolution of cybersecurity and data privacy and the importance of this at the board level, that it's no longer just an IT or privacy issue. It's actually a business issue. It's going to impact your brand. It's going to impact your customers internally and regulatory. You're going to get fined, etc. So it's really a company top-down approach. You need accountability. You need ownership to drive these type of programs. And then you need to do, as you mentioned, continuous awareness training. So something that is often overlooked is the importance of the training aspect, because really your people are your weakest link. So if they don't get trained, then they're not going to be able to detect issues. If they don't understand the most basic things about phishing, etc., you're going to have issues. You're going to have insider issues. So all of these things need to be a consistent, ongoing process within a company.
Parag?
Yeah, sure. So thanks for inviting me here, and all great points already covered by Jason. But I think what I would like to add is that you asked about how do we communicate this to the board, and as Jason mentioned, the board is looking more and more into the cyber risk as well. So it's important that we don't leave cybersecurity as part of the IT organization. It's more a business risk, as Jason mentioned, and hence it has to be brought up to the level of enterprise risk management. So if your company has a chief risk officer, then the chief risk officer and the CISO need to work together on this. And in financial services, we do have something like the 3 lines of defense, right? So we have the first line of defense, which is responsible for implementing the controls, which is probably the IT organization or the CISO organization. But the second line of defense, that is the risk management team and the compliance team, they are also responsible for looking at the adequacy of the controls, looking at, and trying to communicate these risks in a language that the board understands, and make sure that the board allocates all the adequate resources required for protecting the company from the cyber risk. Also, it is important for the board to be educated. So the awareness trainings is not only for the employees of the organization, but also for the board members. It's very important for the board members to be also involved in in the drills, in the incident response drills, because the board members are also going to face the media or the stakeholders, other stakeholders of the company, in responding to these kind of cyber attacks or providing information about these cyber attacks. So it's important for the board members also be trained adequately and also to be part of these regular incident response drills at a large level.
Okay. Now, let's just go back. Tony, there's a couple of questions come back to it, is that when you mentioned the airline and mobile company data breaches. The question is, also related to cyber risk, maybe Shannon, you can provide some guideline as well. Any material regulatory penalty on this company? I'm not so sure I understand this question correctly. Not sure which regulator and whether substantial penalty are in place for serious breach involving non-financial organization. Tony?
Yep. First of all, under the current personal data privacy law right now in Hong Kong, we do not yet have a mandatory data breach notification system. Neither do we have the power to administer administrative fines for companies breaching personal data privacy. But audience may be aware that earlier this year in January 2020, the government has made in public that there would be several preliminary direction of amendments to our data protection law. And part of it would be related to establishing a mandatory data breach notification system, and goes with it a stronger deterrent sanction power, including vesting the power with us to administer administrative fines. So these are for the future legislative possible amendment exercise. And I wish to add one point about dealing with data breaches. Of course, we would very much like those companies which had a data breach to approach us, because our target is to help them, to try to share our experience with them as to how to contain damage. And the company would need to think about the affected customers first as well. Very often when the company is in crisis, they think rather inwardly how to protect themselves, how to protect the company. This is of course very understandable and legitimate, but because data privacy touches on the personal data privacy of those individuals, so they are the one who are being affected. So company have to put them on the radar screen. And of course, when things happen, company would try to find out the causes of data breaches, what went wrong, etc. These are, of course, necessary steps, but companies should at the same time be aware that they should not take too long time before they inform the affected customers. You will remember that for the airline case back in late 2018, the company took 7 months before they informed the customers, and the customers would have adverse feeling to this. So a totality approach is important, whereby you try to, at the top management, to try to maneuver what would be the best for the company as a whole and also for the affected individuals. So these steps are not necessarily sequential in trying to find out the cause, informing the regulator, informing the affected individuals. So have to take a totality approach. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tony. There's a next question. I'm not so sure anyone can answer this, but maybe Shannon, you might want to try. You can see the question as well. What is the legal recourse for the ordinary consumer in these cases? So if I'm a consumer, what can I do?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it comes down to, it would be dependent on which country you're in, but following on from what Tony said, and this is actual natural follow on from the previous question, is in Australia, we do have a notifiable data breach scheme. Now, those notifiable data breaches are limited to companies that are subject to the Privacy Act of 1988, which is all Australian organisations, but it is limited to companies that have an annual turnover of $3 million per year or greater. Now, the qualifying language for what determines a notifiable data breach is whether it has the potential to cause serious harm to the data owners whose data has been breached. Now, some lawyers could argue until they're blue in the face about what constitutes serious harm, but if that company is found to have not abided by their duty of care or the regulations, and they mishandled the data, if they didn't protect the data adequately despite being encouraged and required to do so, or if they didn't notify the data owners quickly enough, there is a possibility for pursuit of litigation by those data owners. You only have to look at the perfect case study would be Yahoo, when they were being acquired by Verizon. They'd kept secret a data breach, a huge data breach, for a number of years, and it came to light only in the middle of their acquisition process by Verizon, and subsequently they had $350 million wiped off their market cap. But not only that, the costs extend far beyond the reduction in their market value. There's regulatory fines, and then there's pursuit of litigation by data owners who feel that they were misled or that their data was abused or mishandled by the company. And then there's loss of goodwill and loss of trust. And you have to think about companies these days. You know, companies of yesteryear, most of their value was tied up in tangible assets, factories and companies and people. Nowadays, the most valuable companies, their assets are intangible assets. And a lot of that those intangible assets is their goodwill or the reputation of the company. Now, if a data breach can have a huge material effect on the trust and the goodwill and the reputation of a company. You only have to look at Facebook, where 75% of their market value is tied up in their reputation and their goodwill. If they suffered a data breach and had, say, 10% loss of trust, that's still billions of dollars worth of economic loss on top of the litigation and the fines and the actual loss of the data. So there's huge ramifications that extend. The ripples go quite far. So in terms of just pursuit of litigation by the data owners, that is possible. Whether typically those types of incidents, if it's large enough, will be a class action, but individuals can pursue it if they have the financial means to do so. I dare say it could go one of two ways, where they're in a long, drawn-out legal battle with a company that has substantially more funding than they do, or the company will just want to brush it under a rug and they'll settle quite quickly just so they don't suffer any more significant loss of reputation and damage to their goodwill and the trust of their brand.
Okay, before we move to the next segment, which is third-party risk and gig economy, online participants, any questions? Or live participants, any questions? Okay, so let's move on to the third-party risk segment. Jason and Parag, questions for you. Okay, so how can legal and compliance team work with information security team? I'm pretty sure you are quite familiar in this area to review their security status of third-party supplier and vendor.
I guess I'll go. Yeah, sure, no problem. So we work very closely. So even within our, especially in our team, we do have a person that's a dedicated legal security person. So although legal, we do have our own legal teams. They focus generally on the day-to-day legal projects, general counsel, etc. The legal person in our team actually focuses very specifically on the regulatory, security, legal, privacy requirements in the different regions. So this helps us to bridge the gap. We have a very strong team that we work with, and I've seen this in other companies as well, where during the process of new developments of new projects or third-party vendors that you will use, doing a security impact assessment and also doing a privacy impact assessment, part of the criteria within that requires you to go through all of the due diligence. So it's not just doing the security check. It's not just testing the APIs to see whether or not there's any vulnerabilities. It's also doing, from a legal perspective, what are the cross-border data transfer issues? Have they signed a data processing agreement? What do they do in regards to relationships, for example, in countries that acknowledge a controller processor type of arrangement? You know, is it a joint controller agreement? Is it a joint processor? Is it a controller processor type of agreement? So all of these things are needed in the discussion to firstly understand the risks and the responsibilities from a governance perspective, legal perspective, and then that flows to the technical perspective. Because once we have that in place and we understand where our risks are and we understand our exposure, then that's when we can put the right type of controls in place to manage that. So say, for example, we're doing business with some third party, and the third party happens to be storing the data on a server in some location that is risky for the business that we're in, then we have to potentially think about using another supplier. So there are these type of considerations that have to be thought of. So it's really going hand in hand together. So before this day and age, I think if you go back in time, it was really a little bit more segregated, the whole legal side and the IT side. But now you're seeing, even with the professional associations that we're seeing at the International Association of Privacy Professionals, or whether it's ISACA, etc., there are more and more groups that are collaborating on these type of projects, because it's no longer that the legal team can simply say, look, here's the regulation. The regulation of GDPR says you need to have privacy by design. There, go, tech team, go and do it. It's not like, it's just impossible. Where do you start? So there has to be that level of collaboration that's needed in this day and age.
Okay, Parag, I understand that you deal with third-party risk, I wouldn't say issue, but implementation. Can you walk us through?
Yeah, definitely. I think Jason has covered most of the points. I think it's very important for the security team, again, to work very closely with the legal and compliance team while drafting the contract itself, for a new agreement or a new service, because there are multiple considerations here, including where as Jason mentioned, where the data is going to be stored, and it could be that the third party is going to use further fourth party or fifth party, or giving out some work to other vendors as well. So it's important to cover all of that within your agreement. Also, I think it's important to make sure that you have the right to audit as part of your contracts or agreements, because when you're doing the initial agreement, when you're doing the initial assessment, you probably cover a lot of points, but on an ongoing basis, on a probably periodic basis, could be annual, could be 6 monthly, could be quarterly, you need to continuously keep revisiting these controls, because there's a lot of changes which happen during the course of the year or during the period of time when you are in contract with the service provider. So you need to have a right to audit on a periodic basis. So that has to be covered in the contract as well. Apart from that, I think it's important also to give importance, as Jason mentioned, to certain standards like ISO 27001 or PCI standards for that, PCI compliance, etc., as part of your agreement if that is required. If you're going to store credit card information or customer information with the service provider. The other point also to note probably here is there are, like you have credit rating agencies. Now you have security rating agencies available which provide ratings for various vendors. So that would be something which you could also leverage and look at different vendors, what are their security ratings, and what is the minimum rating that you need for them to maintain during their service agreement. So these are some of the points you could also look into for the third party risk.
Okay. Shannon, this question might come to you quite often from your client, maybe. With the situation right now, working from home, and nobody can travel, how do you tighten security control of access? Especially most people are working from home, and how do you apply control to mitigate insider threat by rogue or naive employees?
Well, it's become a lot more difficult with remote working, hasn't it? You've got this rapid transition to working from home at the start of the lockdown due to COVID, and you've got to consider many businesses had employees that didn't have company issued devices. They only had PCs that they were permanently strapped to their desks, and they had to somehow use their own personal laptops and bring them onto the corporate network. And obviously the same protections weren't applied, the same basic installed software, and there was a significant issue of the rise of shadow IT, where people were downloading software that they saw necessary and saw fit to do their job, and whilst they were doing it to be able to do their job, and they didn't understand fully the privacy and the data security risks that came along with that. And even when properly implementing remote working, sometimes insecure remote desktop protocols, which has been a huge issue for us, particularly for our digital forensics and incident response team. A lot of the methods of entry of malicious actors has been through improperly secured remote desktop protocols, so RDP. So it's been a significant issue, and I think there's no one answer to be able to prevent the data security and data privacy risk or mitigate it fully with a mass transition to working from home, or that hybrid model that companies continue to do that are coming out of lockdown. Like us personally, we also work from home and work from the office during the week. And it's about, again, what Tony and Jason and Parag have already spoken about, is implementing a training program that makes the employees aware of the risks that they face, having the IT team being aware of what devices their employees are using and what software they've downloaded, and being reducing the issue of shadow IT. It's about having monitoring and logging implemented across your entire network and automated where possible. But obviously different businesses have different budgets. Not every business can implement monitoring and logging, or the latest fancy IDS, or then they can't afford an external or internal SOC. So it's difficult to apply a silver bullet, or there's no panacea for the issue of remote working. Again, it has to be a risk-based approach based on that organization. But at the end of the day, it comes down to the best way to prevent a data breach or to mitigate cybersecurity risk to an acceptable level with remote working is to address the human, to address the human element through training, but also, and Jason and Parag covered it before, but there's an issue. We can't just focus on the human element of cyber risk. Yes, they are, statistically our weakest link, and that's where a lot of the data breaches come from. But often when we implement technology or cybersecurity controls, we forget to consider that human behavior element. If you implement friction into an end user's workflows, whether you mean to or not, by implementing a security control that makes their job harder, when there's friction in a workflow, what's going to happen? That control will be circumvented. People will always take the easiest route. It's the same as having a footpath and there's a nice big grassed area in the middle that's at a right angle. There's going to be a worn dirt path right through the middle of that grassed area because people are going to take the straightest route and the easiest route to get to their destination. The same principle applies in technology and cybersecurity. You have to implement technology controls that have minimal friction in the end user's workflow. So when you design technology control, or you implement new tech, or you design cybersecurity controls, remember to get the feedback of your employees and your end users and make sure that it's fit for purpose for them to be able to do their jobs and to achieve your aims of protecting their data as well.
Okay, thank you. We have a lot of questions coming in. So I'm just gonna give you guys a scenario here. Assuming that I'm a disgruntled employee because with time like that, a lot of companies are trying to cut down their workforce because of the economy. And I'm not happy. But in recent days, I have received a lot of malicious link, and I know those are malicious link. Okay, supposed to be COVID news and all that and stuff. I've been educated, I've been trained in the likes of in London, the leadership of Parag or Tony or Jason or yourself. So I kept all this link. The last day that you fire me, I click on every single link. How do we prevent it?
Are you asking
Jason,
me?
you want to answer that?
Oh no, Jason, you answer that.
I'm not so sure there is an answer for this, but but this actually case does happen. So,
so I mean, to get just to understand the story correct, what you're saying is that the employee just wants to be a pain in the butt and be malicious and click on all of the bad links on the last day. Is that what is that? I'm just trying to wrap the question around my head. That's all.
That is true. That is basically disgruntled employee behavior most of the time.
Well, right. So again, there's no perfect solution for everything, right? So assuming you're in a multinational, even if you did click on some of these links and you're on the Office network, you may have endpoint detection and endpoint protection already. So, to some extent, you may be a little bit protected already, right? But having said that, we can't always protect ourselves from everything. So I think this goes down to a procedural control. So when organizations do let people go and or they resign or get fired or whatever, there's generally a pretty good process for doing so. You see it in big banks, you see whatever. Sometimes they get walked out the door. There's no opportunity to even do that, even if they wanted to. So that is an extreme example, but yeah, I would really put it on more of a procedural method of offboarding them in a proper way, so that these things don't really happen.
Okay, so let us go for two more questions because I want to address these questions before we end our session today. Cases by Tony. For companies having operation in UK, they have to observe. I mean, you can see the question there, gentlemen. To observe the new enactment of UK data privacy law for Brexit from 2021 onwards. UK law has adopted GDPR standard for post-2020 regulatory control. Is there any practical advice for Hong Kong company having operation in UK?
Thank you for the
Tony?
question. We, PCPD, regulate personal data privacy on the basis of our own law. So we can't sort of give advice on how the external laws in other countries to operate. But companies could make some reference to what we have done in terms of we have some booklets introducing the GDPR, and also we issued a second edition this year, and to highlight the aspects that they could pay attention to, and also contrast those regulation with Hong Kong. One point which I would like to highlight, that is we are always asked about this question. Given that there are a lot of different privacy laws all around the world, and each is different from another in certain aspects. So how a company can do best in order to protect themselves and in order to conduct trade globally? That is a fair question. Of course, from the international arena, the data protection authorities try to make laws interoperable in different jurisdictions. But at the end of the day, each domestic law has to cater for its domestic scenario, its domestic circumstances. What we would like to advise in general terms, is that on the one hand, I think speakers have already mentioned this point before, is in treating personal data privacy, the compliance with the law is only a basic level and the floor minimum. The expectations of the stakeholders are increasing all the time, and technology is always progressing. So the stakeholders' expectation, particularly on the part of the individuals, are basically forever leading the law. So I think at the end of the day, we need to have a concept and a thinking that we have to treat personal data as something that belongs to the individuals. And because it belongs to the individuals, you have to try to comfort the individuals by systems, mechanism, technical and organizational measures whereby you can show that you are respectful to them, you are fair to them, and you are creating not only benefits to your own self in terms of the company, but actually creating mutual benefits to the customers, so that even if data breaches occur, and if you handle them reasonably, speedily, effectively, and efficiently, you hopefully would not lose the trust of the customers. You have to try to be transparent in your systems, processes. You have to try to be explainable on your action or inaction, so that the customers would always feel that you hold them in your heart and you treat them well. And so I think that goes beyond the legal aspect of compliance. You have to be accountable to the individuals in treating their personal data. So that is what I would like to share with the audience. Thank you.
So
Thank you,
I guess
Tony.
just to add on to that, I just pasted a link into the chat box for all of your attendees. So my role as well, I wear multiple hats in industry. One of them is the regional lead for the International Association of Privacy Professionals. And what we try to do where possible is to provide more practical guidance on privacy. So that link that you'll see is a relatively useful one. We'll see it's specifically about the Brexit privacy checklist. So specifically, the question was, what type of guidance can we provide in regards to Brexit? So have a look at that. You can also have a look at the IPP website. There's a lot of resource there and checklists there that you might find quite practical. That's you just download and start using. But by all means, there's just as Tony had mentioned, there are so many things that need to be considered. But this checklist here is at least somewhere or something that you can start to use to give you a little bit of guidance. And I'm sure there's going to be more questions that will be raised along the way. But at least I think it's a good start for your attendees to use.
Okay, last question before we conclude. Any questions from the floor? The floor is very quiet today. No? Okay, I'm going to continue with the last question. From legacy to cloud, Shannon, maybe you can comment on that, and perhaps Parag and Jason as well. Now, because of this COVID-19 or pandemic, a lot of organizations are now thinking about moving to cloud or transform the organization into more digital workflow. How do you identify shadow IT and how do you identify shadow and legacy IT that poses security risks and create a strategy to migrate into cloud and have a data erasure policy to minimize data breach? This basically goes back to the very first beginning of, I think Tony commented on the data breach cases and such. Shannon, why don't you start first?
You could spend an entire hour again on cloud transformation. That's a big question to ask as a final one. I'll be brief to get the others a chance to speak. It's going to be different for each country about data governance and data privacy laws that you have to abide by. Typically in Australia, if we're say spinning down an old on-prem or legacy system and migrating that data to cloud, we might have to keep that data around for 7 years. There's also contractual requirements as well based on your partnerships with other companies. So it's not just regulatory standards that you have to meet. As Parag rightly said, there's the right to audit for many companies. So if you're storing another company's data that you've been doing work with, you might have a contractual obligation to keep that for even longer. So it's difficult to know what to do and to meet the right standards. Cloud transformation, cloud migration is an extremely complicated process. And the larger the company is and the more complex it is, the more difficult it is. And particularly when there's organizations who don't have the right internal capability to be able to do so, we find a lot of duplication of legacy systems. We've come across businesses before where they've got 10 or 15 ERPs and it's less than 1,000-person company because one business unit has procured an ERP and then without speaking to another business unit within the company, they've procured it from a different vendor and the duplication happens and it's just a waste of cost, but also there's duplication of data as well, just because you're aware of data in one particular system or one repository. It doesn't mean it's not duplicated elsewhere or stored on individual personal devices. So being aware of where all of your data and what systems that you have before you even begin to consider a cloud migration is the first step. It's that complete data and system assessment across your entire IT architecture, including personal devices, is the first step. And being aware of your regional and national specific guidelines and regulations and your contractual obligations that you have to meet in either data deletion or data transference, and who has access to that data. Again, going back to that original point that Tony made about who has access to that data.
Yeah, maybe I can just add. Data governance is a good point, very good point which Shannon mentioned, and it's a good opportunity when you're moving from legacy applications to the cloud to do some data cleansing activities and make sure what data you really want to port to the cloud. Also, when you're moving to the cloud, it's important to look at what are the responsibilities of the cloud service provider, because they will differ based on what kind of service you're opting for. So if you're opting for a completely SaaS service, then most of the responsibilities of security lie with the cloud service provider. But if you're opting for, say, infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, then some of the responsibilities still lie with you as the data owner. So you need to look at what responsibilities still lie with you and manage your policies accordingly. It's also important that when you're putting data onto the cloud, it's no longer within your secure perimeter. So it's important, very important to look at data encryption technologies, data masking, and hashing, etc., to ensure that the data on the cloud remains safe. And even if it does get accessed, by attackers, it's still encrypted and it's difficult for the attackers to actually get that data, actual data. So looking at actually the data encryption capabilities of the service provider, as well as managing the encryption keys, also becomes very important when you are moving to the cloud. Also, there was something about shadow IT. I think, as Shannon mentioned, this is a full topic. We could probably have a full conference around this separately. But shadow IT, definitely there's a lot of monitoring which is required on shadow IT. And today there are technologies available where to a large extent you can minimize shadow IT to a large extent.
Okay, we are 1 minute. Tony, any last comments, insight for all our attendees? As you can see, the attendee here as well.
Thank you. Perhaps just very brief, talking about cybersecurity, and I think people kind of focus on how they can defend or protect themselves from the outside attack. But there are things which we need to ensure proper access within an organization. And for instance, zero trust architecture, because at the end of the day, you only allow people who has a need to know basis to access the information. There have been cases whereby, say, an employee get the personal data of a data subject from a data user from the company without the company's consent. And the person disclosed the data online and causing psychological harm to the data subject. So this is what we call a doxing, which happened last year in Hong Kong. And last month in Hong Kong, there was a court case whereby the court convicted the defendant that it has obtained personal data from a data user without consent and causing psychological harm. So what I want to emphasize here is that apart from those cyber security defense, look inside to ensure that you have the proper structure in place, segmentation, access of information, so that you have the best possible protection of personal data privacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Shannon and Farad. Thank you for your insights. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your participation. Can we give a warm thank you, applause for our panelists? And we have 160 people. If we can give a little applause to everyone, that would be great. We're going to take a 5-minute break. We come back to our last sessions for our main session before we go to our breakout or before our lunch at 12:25. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.